For decades, the golden age of Hollywood was defined by men who didn't just play characters but embodied entire philosophies of existence. Among them, two names stood like granite pillars, casting long, intimidating shadows over the silver screen: Anthony Quinn and Charles Bronson. They were the masters of the unsaid, the kings of a raw, unvarnished masculinity that felt dangerous, unpredictable, and deeply authentic. To the public, they were the ultimate tough guys, men who seemed to have been forged in fire rather than discovered in a studio backlot. Yet, for nearly half a century, a strange and heavy silence hung between them. While other legends of their era traded anecdotes or engaged in public rivalries, Anthony Quinn remained notably reserved whenever the conversation turned toward Charles Bronson. This silence fueled decades of speculation. Was there a hidden grudge born on a dusty film set? Was it a clash of massive egos between two men who both refused to blink? Or was it something deeper, a quiet recognition of a mirror image that was too painful to look at? The world saw them as rivals for the same rugged roles. But the truth, which Quinn would only reveal in the twilight of his life, was far more profound. It wasn't a story of animosity, but a narrative of a shared, brutal origin that neither man could ever truly leave behind. Anthony Quinn and Charles Bronson were both survivors of a world that didn't want them to succeed. They were outsiders who fought their way into the inner sanctum of an industry that preferred polished surfaces over scarred souls. When Quinn finally chose to speak, his words were not those of a competitor, but of a kindred spirit who had finally decided to lower his guard. He spoke of Bronson not as a wall of stone, but as a man who wore that wall as armor, because the world had taught him that vulnerability was a death sentence. In this investigation, we are peeling back the layers of that armor. We are going beyond the iconic roles and the tabloid headlines to understand the unspoken pact between these two titans. This is not just a tribute to their filmography. It is a deep dive into the psychology of survival, the cost of fame, and the rare honesty that exists between two men who grew up knowing the weight of hunger and the pressure to survive. Today, we explore the moment the silence finally broke, revealing the heart of the man behind the myth. This is the untold bond of Anthony Quinn and Charles Bronson. To understand the connection between Anthony Quinn and Charles Bronson, one must look far beyond the bright lights of Hollywood and the glamour of Academy Award ceremonies. You have to travel back to the dirt and the grit of the early 20th century, to a time when survival was not a given, but a daily battle. Both men were born into circumstances that should have swallowed them whole, and it was this shared legacy of hardship that created an invisible thread between them long before they ever stepped onto a film set. Anthony Quinn was born Manuel Antonio Rodolfo Quinn Huajaca in 1915, in the midst of the bloody chaos of the Mexican Revolution. His very arrival into the world was marked by upheaval. His father was a man of Irish descent who fought alongside Pancho Villa, and his mother was a Mexican woman who carried the resilience of her ancestors. From his earliest breaths, Quinn was a child of conflict and movement. When his family migrated to Los Angeles, they didn't find the land of plenty. They found the grinding, soul-crushing reality of poverty. Young Anthony didn't have the luxury of a carefree childhood. Instead, his formative years were shaped by manual labor and the constant pressure to provide. He was a boy who knew the weight of a shovel and the sting of a punch, working in construction and even stepping into the boxing ring to help his family keep their heads above water. These weren't just jobs. They were lessons in the human condition. Every drop of sweat and every bruise on his knuckles lent a profound authenticity and grit to the characters he would later portray. When Anthony Quinn played a man who had been beaten down by life, he wasn't acting. He was remembering. He knew what it felt like to have nothing but your dignity and your hands. Across the country, in the dismal coal country of Ehrenfeld, Pennsylvania, a young boy named Charles Bukinski, later known as Charles Bronson, was living a parallel nightmare. Bronson was the 11th of 15 children born to Lithuanian immigrants. While Quinn was battling the heat of Los Angeles, Bronson was submerged in the literal darkness of the earth. His family was so destitute that he famously had to wear his sister's dress to school because there were no other clothes available. By the time he was a teenager, he was working in the coal mines alongside his brothers, breathing in the dust, and facing the constant threat of a cave-in for a few cents a day. This is the shared background that Quinn would later identify as the true source of Bronson's power. Both men had grown up knowing hunger as a constant companion. They knew the specific, sharp anxiety of not knowing where the next meal would come from, and the heavy burden of being a working man before they were even old enough to shave. This wasn't the kind of struggle you talk about at cocktail parties. It was the kind that settles in your bones and changes the way you look at the world. Quinn later reflected that people saw Bronson as an unbreakable wall of stone. But Quinn saw the armor. He recognized that the hardness in Bronson's eyes was the same hardness he had seen in the mirrors of his own youth. It was the face of a man who had clawed his way up from the very bottom. They were both outsiders. One a Mexican-Irish immigrant in a prejudiced society, the other the son of Eastern European miners in a cold, industrial landscape. They were kindred spirits, forged in the same furnace of adversity. This shared history created a silent understanding. They didn't need to speak, because they both knew the price of the lives they had led. When they eventually met in the high-stakes world of Hollywood, they didn't see movie stars. They saw two survivors who had managed to escape the mines and the barrios, carrying the ghosts of their past into the glare of the spotlight. The journey from the depths of poverty to the heights of Hollywood stardom is rarely a straight line. And for Anthony Quinn and Charles Bronson, the paths were as unconventional as the men themselves. While they shared a foundation of hardship, the catalysts that propelled them into the arts were remarkably different, reflecting the unique facets of their creative spirits. For Quinn, the transformation began not with a script, but with a blueprint. In a turn of events that seems almost cinematic, a young Anthony Quinn found himself drawn to the world of art and architecture. This interest led him to an apprenticeship under the legendary architect Frank Lloyd Wright. It was Wright, a man who understood the power of form and presence, who first recognized that Quinn's true medium wasn't stone or steel, but the human experience. Wright noticed Quinn's expressive power and distinctive physical presence, and encouraged him to pursue acting as a way to correct a speech impediment after a surgery. This guidance was a pivotal moment, shifting Quinn from the world of structural design to the construction of complex characters. However, Hollywood in the 1,930 seconds was not a place of equal opportunity. Despite his talent, Quinn spent years trapped in the stifling box of ethnic typecasting. Because of the industry's rigid limitations, he was often relegated to minor, stereotypical roles playing the exotic villain, the nameless henchman, or the generic, ethnic foil to white leading men. Yet, Quinn approached these bit parts with the same intensity he would later bring to his masterpieces. He was honing his craft in the shadows, waiting for the moment the industry's imagination would catch up to his depth. He refused to let the smallness of the roles diminish the scale of his ambition, working tirelessly to transcend the labels placed upon him. While Quinn was navigating the prejudices of Tinseltown, Charles Bronson was navigating the life and death stakes of World War II. After years in the coal mines, Bronson traded the darkness of the earth for the vastness of the sky, serving as an aerial gunner in the U.S. Army Air Forces. He flew 25 missions in the Pacific Theater, earning a Purple Heart for wounds received in battle. It was only after the war, while working various odd jobs, that he stumbled into a theater group in Philadelphia. Like Quinn, Bronson's early career was a grind of tough guy archetypes and uncredited roles. He was the heavy, the silent muscle, the man who looked like he had seen too much and said too little. He didn't have the benefit of a mentor like Frank Lloyd Wright. He had the benefit of a face that told 1,000 stories without a single line of dialogue. Both men were essentially fighting a war of attrition against a studio system that valued pretty boys over real men. Quinn later noted that this period of struggle was essential to the intelligence and discipline he saw in Bronson. They weren't just learning how to act, they were learning how to occupy space in an industry that was skeptical of their origins. They were building a professional resilience that would eventually allow them to dominate the screen. By the time they finally reached a level of fame where they could choose their own projects, they weren't just actors, they were architects of a new kind of cinema. One built on the raw, unvarnished truth of the human condition. They had survived the mines, the wars, and the typecasting. And they were finally ready to show the world the power of the working man, who refused to be broken. The professional collision of these two titans finally occurred in the late 1960 seconds on the set of the epic film Guns for San Sebastian. By 1968, Anthony Quinn was already a two-time Academy Award winner and a global icon, while Charles Bronson was on the precipice of becoming the highest-paid actor in the world. On the surface, the production was a clash of styles. Quinn brought his expansive, philosophical, and exuberant energy to the screen, a style that had become his trademark since his legendary turn in Zorba the Greek. Bronson, meanwhile, arrived with his signature simmering intensity. A man who seemed to communicate more through a squint of his eyes than most actors could with a 5-minute monologue. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was thick with a unique kind of tension. It wasn't the petty bickering of stars, but rather the heavy, mutual observation of two predators sharing the same territory. Quinn noted that many people on the crew and in the public saw Charles as nothing more than an unbreakable wall of stone. There were rumors that Bronson was difficult, unapproachable, and perhaps even limited in his emotional range. But Quinn, with his seasoned eye for human depth, saw something entirely different. He realized that Bronson wasn't being difficult. He was being disciplined. Quinn observed that Bronson didn't waste a single word or a single movement. In an industry where many actors thrived on theatrical gestures and grand speeches, Bronson relied on a quiet power that audiences found impossible to ignore. Quinn began to understand that Bronson's silence wasn't a lack of talent, but a deliberate choice. It was the armor he wore for the world. This realization changed the way Quinn viewed his co-star. He saw that every silence in Bronson's performance meant something profound. During the filming in the rugged landscapes of Mexico, Quinn saw a reflection of his own past in the way Bronson handled himself. He recognized that Bronson's toughness was less about his ego and far more about self-preservation. When you come from the background they shared poverty, manual labor, and the constant pressure to survive, you don't trust easily. Quinn saw that Bronson had learned early on that vulnerability could be exploited, a lesson that stayed with him throughout his entire career. While they were filming the high-stakes action sequences, the contrast in their personalities became even more apparent. Quinn thrived on the chaos, the people, and the noise of a busy set. But he watched as Bronson preferred distance and silence. Yet, Quinn never interpreted this as arrogance. Instead, he saw it as Bronson's way of maintaining control in a Hollywood system that often tried to reshape actors into safer, more marketable molds. This mutual, though largely silent, respect became the foundation of their relationship. They were two men who had truly lived the hardships their characters endured on screen. The Battle of San Sebastian wasn't just a movie for them. It was a testament to the authenticity they both brought to a medium that often lacked it. The dynamic between Anthony Quinn and Charles Bronson was a study in profound contradictions, a reality that Quinn became increasingly aware of as their careers progressed in parallel. While they were carved from the same rough stone of poverty and early struggle, they chose entirely different ways to inhabit the world of celebrity. Quinn, by his own admission, was a man who thrived on chaos. He was expansive, loud, and deeply social, surrounding himself with people, art, and the vibrant noise of a life lived at full volume. He saw his life as an ever-extending canvas, filled with multiple marriages, a dozen children, and a constant hunger for emotional and physical stimulation. To Quinn, being alive meant being in the thick of the fray, engaging with the world with a restlessness that was both his greatest strength and his most significant flaw. In stark contrast, Charles Bronson was a man of distance and silence. While Quinn was the hurricane, Bronson was the eye of the storm, quiet, watchful, and deliberately removed from the Hollywood machinery. Quinn observed that where he needed the energy of a crowd, Charles preferred the solace of solitude. This wasn't merely a personality quirk. It was a fundamental difference in how two survivors dealt with the trauma of their past. Quinn channeled his history into a manic, creative energy that produced over 150 films, thousands of paintings, and a complex personal life. Bronson, however, used his past as a shield, creating a persona that was so guarded it bordered on the impenetrable. Quinn was often asked about this unapproachable quality in Bronson, and in breaking his silence, he offered a defense that only someone with a similar history could provide. He admitted that Charles was guarded, but he emphasized that it was for a very good reason. He explained that when you come from the depths of desperation and hunger, you learn early that trust is an expensive luxury. For Bronson, the silence wasn't a sign of arrogance or a lack of intelligence. It was a tactical necessity. He had learned that vulnerability could be exploited, so he simply removed vulnerability from the equation altogether. Quinn deeply admired this discipline. He noted that while he himself was often impulsive and driven by an insatiable ego, Bronson possessed a simmering intensity that required immense self-control. Quinn realized that Bronson's refusal to engage in the typical Hollywood song and dance was his way of maintaining control in an industry that constantly tried to mold actors into marketable commodities. Bronson refused to be reshaped. He remained the working man from the coal mines, even when he was the highest-paid star on the planet. This difference in their approach to life, Quinn's chaotic engagement versus Bronson's guarded solitude, ultimately highlighted their shared authenticity. Quinn believed that the global audience connected to Bronson not just because of the violence or revenge depicted in his films, but because they saw a man who truly looked like he had lived the hardships his characters endured. In Quinn's eyes, they were both honest in their strength, even if they expressed that strength in polar opposite ways. Quinn's eventual tribute was an acknowledgement that Bronson's stone wall was just as valid a survival strategy as his own exuberant chaos. As the decades rolled on, the public images of these two men became almost mythological. Anthony Quinn was the Florentine of Hollywood, a polymath who painted, sculpted, and lived a life of operatic scale. His personal life was as expansive and complicated as the characters he played, marked by 3 marriages and a restless nature that he admitted he could rarely restrain. From his first marriage to Catherine DeMille, which connected him to the industry's inner circle, to his final years with Catherine Benvin, Quinn's journey was one of constant emotional reinvention. He was a man who fathered 13 children across several decades, embracing fatherhood even in his advanced age with a fierce pride. To Quinn, creativity was not limited to the screen. It was a way of life that required passion and fearlessness. Charles Bronson, meanwhile, had become the ultimate vigilante, a symbol of the working man who refused to be broken by a corrupt world. While Quinn was exhibiting artwork in galleries around the world, reflecting on identity and purpose, Bronson was cementing his status as a cinematic icon of justice and revenge. For a long time, the two men seemed to occupy different universes, one of vibrant cultural expression and the other of quiet, simmering intensity. Yet, the shared history of poverty and struggle remained the anchor they both held onto. It was only in the quiet reflections of his later years that Anthony Quinn finally chose to break his long-standing silence regarding Bronson. He realized that the world had turned Bronson into a caricature, a wall of stone that lacked humanity. Quinn felt a responsibility to set the record straight, not through gossip or sensationalism, but through the lens of mutual understanding. He dismissed the idea that Bronson was a one-dimensional actor, pointing instead to the immense discipline and intelligence required to dominate a scene through silence. Charles didn't waste words, Quinn explained, recognizing that every movement Bronson made was a calculated piece of a larger, authentic performance. In breaking his silence, Quinn made it clear that his goal was to humanize a man who had become a symbol. He spoke of Bronson's solitary nature not as arrogance, but as a necessary distance, a way to maintain control in an industry that tried to commodify everything. Quinn admitted that neither he nor Bronson were perfect men, but he argued that Bronson possessed a rare honesty in his strength. By choosing to speak, Quinn offered a final, respectful tribute to a fellow survivor. He wanted the world to see the man who had clawed his way out of the coal mines, just as Quinn had clawed his way out of the barrios. It was a moment of profound clarity, where one legend reached across the decades to validate the struggle and the success of another, proving that beneath the fame and the tough guy personas, there was a shared heart forged in the fires of real life. The final years of Anthony Quinn's life were a far cry from the dusty movie sets of Mexico or the frantic energy of Hollywood's golden age. In the quiet twilight of his journey, he chose to withdraw from the relentless glare of the spotlights and the noise of public expectation. He found a final sanctuary in the coastal town of Bristol, Rhode Island, a place where the air was thick with the scent of the sea, and the pace of life was dictated by the tides rather than the demands of a director. It was here, in a beautiful home overlooking the sweeping vistas of Narragansett Bay, that the man who had lived 1,000 lives finally found a sense of peace. Even as his health began to decline, Quinn remained a man of deep reflection and creative passion. He spent his days surrounded by the simple pleasures he had often sacrificed for his career: the privacy of his studio, the company of his family, and the endless horizon that seemed to stretch toward the future he was preparing to leave behind. On the 3rd of June 2001, at the age of 86, the world lost one of its most formidable artistic voices. Quinn passed away in Boston due to respiratory failure, marking the end of an extraordinary era. The news of his death sparked a global wave of sorrow, as fans from every corner of the earth mourned the loss of a man who was, in every sense of the word, larger than life. In a final act that was as poetic as it was personal, Quinn's family requested a unique honor. Instead of a traditional cemetery, his wife sought permission to bury him in the place he loved most, his own backyard in Bristol. Today, Anthony Quinn rests near an old maple tree on the property he purchased in 1995, forever looking out over the bay that brought him solace in his final years. It was a fitting conclusion for a man who had spent his life exploring the boundaries of identity and home. When we look back at the lives of Anthony Quinn and Charles Bronson, we aren't just looking at the filmography of two movie stars. We are looking at a masterclass in human resilience. Both men entered an industry that was designed to exclude them, and both men conquered it by refusing to apologize for who they were. Quinn, with his exuberant chaos, and Bronson, with his simmering silence, proved that there is no single way to be a man or a survivor. Quinn's decision to break his silence on Bronson was his final gift to the history of cinema. He chose to strip away the stone wall myth and replace it with a human truth: that beneath the toughness was a man of intelligence, discipline, and profound honesty. Their legacy is one of honesty in strength, a rare quality that continues to resonate with audiences today. They were the last of a breed of actors who didn't just perform, they lived. And through their shared bond of hardship and triumph, they left an indelible mark on the stars that will never fade.